towards establishing the forest and the new authority there as well. Tonight, this is hosted by Oregon State University. I'm Paul Odenthal. I'm the Senior Associate Vice President for Administration here at OSU, and I'll be moderating tonight's session as well. So tonight we will be going through our financial analysis about sustainability and the costs around the forest and operating the forest going forward as well. And we look forward to sharing the presentation with you that we gave to the advisory committee just last week. We're going to go through that again tonight with you, and then and open it up for questions and make sure we have plenty of time for questions as well. We have an hour and a half tonight. We'll go till 7 or till we run out of questions. And the presentation will probably be less than 30 minutes at the beginning of this as well. Just to go over some of the logistics for tonight, we are going to record this session tonight, and it will be posted on the OSU Elliott website as well as on the DSL website in the very near future as well. And again, our format tonight, Shannon Murray will be giving the presentation on our financials. We'll ask that you hold questions at that, hold your questions till the end. And then after the presentation, we'll ask that you raise your hand, use the raise hand function here in Zoom. And we will call on you in the order that we see the hands come up. Anna and I will do our best to try and keep it in order as the questions come in. And Anna will take you off of mute and allow you to make your comment or your question there as well. To make sure that everyone has a chance to comment tonight, we ask that when you do come off and you give your comment or your question, that you ask one question, try to keep it within 3 minutes as well with your comments. And of course, if you have a clarifying question on what you hear, we'll address that as well. But we ask you keep it to that, and that'll allow us to move to more folks and get more questions in across the group here as well. And of course, if you have more questions than that one as well, we ask you to raise your hand again, and we will get to you again after everyone else has had a chance to go around, and we'll do our best to make that circulation. And I said 3 minutes, I won't be counting, but I ask you to try to keep to that as well. And other piece too is tonight is about the financial presentation you're going to see and the finances around the forest. So we ask you to keep the questions and the conversation around that issue tonight as well. That's what we want to address tonight. There'll be other public forums for other discussion, but let's concentrate on the financials today, which you're all here to hear about, and make sure we spend time on that as well. And final piece, I would just say, let's all be very respectful with each other tonight as well. I know there's many difference of opinions about the future of the Elliott, but I know we all care very much about that future. So let's have a good night tonight, a great discussion. And I appreciate all of you being here with us again as well. So with that, I'd like to quickly introduce the Oregon State team that is with us here tonight. And I will ask them to come off of mute and introduce themselves. And so Anna, would you start us, please?
Absolutely. I am Anna Magnuson. I'm the project coordinator for the Elliott State Research Forest with OSU College of Forestry.
Okay, Katy?
I'm Katy Kavanaugh, the Associate Dean of Research, and I welcome you all here as well. I'm in the College of Forestry, and if I'm looking down, it's not because I'm not listening, it's usually because I'm knitting, so which helps me listen. So
good. Okay, Randy?
Yeah, hi everyone. Welcome. I'm Randy Rosenberger. I'm Associate Dean for Students and Professor of Applied Economics.
Great, thank you. Shannon?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon Murray. I'm also with Oregon State University College of Forestry, and I'm the program director for the Elliott State Research Forest. And thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, and then I see from DSL, I'm not sure I can see everyone here, but I see Geoff Huntington is with us.
I am.
Okay, good evening, Geoff.
I'm here, and I think I'll probably be representing DSL. Malia is monitoring, but will be coming and going throughout the meeting. So I'll be happy to take something if you ask me to.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Geoff. Okay. On that note, team, unless I forgot something, we will turn it over to Shannon and jump right to the presentation.
Okay, thanks so much, Paul. And is that showing correctly?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, again, thank you to everyone for joining us tonight for this public information session. We would like to share with you our current budget model and financial analysis for the Elliott State Research Forest, to talk through some of those details and then answer any questions that you may have. And so let's go ahead and get started. So tonight we'll do a brief introduction, look at revenue assumptions that went into this financial analysis. Then we'll move on to estimated annual expenditures for the Elliott State Research Forest as it's been outlined in the approved research proposal, once that forest is up and running. And then we'll take a step back and look at projected startup costs to get to that fully functioning research forest. And we'd like to dig into a couple of areas in particular, looking in a little bit more detail at infrastructure, working capital, and some of the research program costs that have been estimated as part of this budget model, with an example from the carbon and climate research program. And then we'll finish up with a review of the overall budget model assumptions and where we'll go next. So first, a brief introduction. This financial analysis is OSU's current assessment of operation and research costs tailored to a revenue model that's based on anticipated harvest volumes outlined in the OSU research proposal. So that's based on the experimental design. Harvests are used to implement the experimental design and are not done solely to drive revenue. The numbers in this analysis are estimates that will continue to be refined based on several factors, including a finer scale analysis of the experimental design for the forest and details related to the governance structure and infrastructure. And much of that information is what we're working on in the next year plus as part of the forest management plan development. The requested startup funds were estimated by experts from Oregon State University and other institutions, and were included as part of the OSU research proposal as well as this analysis. The budget model does not account for factors outside of Oregon State University's control, including the new pending ownership structure of an Elliott State Research Forest public entity. And finally, this budget model and anticipated startup funds are subject to change based on new information, including the structure of that public entity, new information as part of the forest management plan development process, and refinement of infrastructure plans. And integrating new information into this financial analysis is folded into the forest management plan timeline. So first, we'll take a look at the revenue assumptions that were used in this financial analysis. So during the research proposal phase, Oregon State University hired Mason, Bruce, and Girard, a natural resources consulting firm that has been in business since 1921, MBG for short. MBG are multidisciplinary leaders working with both the private and public forestry sectors in our region. And so they came in to do some of the budget modeling and financial analysis as part of that research proposal that we are continuing to work with moving forward. Income projections done by MBG are based on existing inventory data that we have and harvest projections in the approved OSU research proposal under that experimental design. As I mentioned, new data is being collected and incorporated into the analysis during the forest management plan process, along with additional criteria for decision-making, which can then be used to update this analysis. According to NBG's financial analysis of the projected 50-year cash flow, which you can see here in this chart, apologies for the background noise. The net timber revenue estimates are between 5.4 and 6.1 million based on the numbers that we're working with. And we'll come back to these numbers in a few slides when we look at net versus gross estimates. And finally here, MBG analysis accounts for market fluxes in timber revenue by using a 5-year average. And so this is folded into all of their analysis. So let's take a step back and look at the type of watershed level information that went into MBG's analysis and some of the numbers that you just saw. This is an example of a watershed that is a triad allocation in the research plan, in the research proposal. And so this is a mixture of, you can see reserve here in the red, intensive in the light green, extensive in the orange, and then the riparian conservation areas in the blue. And so the allocations that you see here were based on the initial analysis done in the research proposal, and were used to drive the modeling and financial analysis done by MBG. The research design and the forest management plan determine where, when, and how harvests occur according to the experimental design. And as I mentioned, this is the information that really drives that financial analysis when we're looking at revenues, as well as the management costs associated with them. And so looking at this example, we can see that the anticipated harvests outlined here are happening at different times over the course of about 65 years. And that timing is dependent on the current age of the stand as of 2020 and the type of treatment for that stand. And just a brief note here that these are estimates and that the timing of harvests may change with more information. And so according to the research proposal, with the extensive treatments, the plan is for approximately 125-year rotation for first retention harvest. And in intensive, the plan is for a 60-year rotation for that regeneration harvest. And there may be intermediate stand treatments such as thinnings in intensive and extensive treatments. And so you'll see those thinnings as well as the regeneration harvest in the next few slides. So the information at this scale from the projected experimental treatments and associated forest management activities are what's driving that financial model. So zooming out to the landscape scale, this is a decision tree used by MBG as part of their analysis for allocating treatments used in that analysis. And so this is the decision tree just for extensive stand allocations, just to give you a sense of the decisions and the information that went into that part of the analysis. And so as we're looking here at extensive, you can see there are two areas here. One is for stands that are greater than 65 years old, and one is for less than, and you can see that they're set up in very similar ways. And so the allocation is based first on whether there is identified marbled, murrelet, or northern spotted owl habitat on that area. If that is the case, based on the data that we have, then that would go into a high retention. If the answer is no, then it goes down to the next level where we're looking at relative density. And you can see here, there are different decision points for greater than 65 and less than 65. But based on that density, that stand would either go into a moderate retention or a low retention. And so those different levels of retention were also part of that analysis that Mason, Bruce, and Girard did as part of their revenue projections. So the green boxes here represent the current stand conditions. So now let's look at the estimated annual harvest per treatment category per year across the entire forest based on the information that we've looked at so far. And again, a note, these are estimates and the timing of the harvest may change with more information gained in part during the forest management plan development process. So the graph on the left here is acres harvested, and this is the current estimate across allocations with 5-year time periods. So it may be a little bit difficult to see depending on how big your screen is, but these are 5-year time periods down here at the bottom, each one of these increments. The model shows a maximum of approximately 1,300 acres per year for the first 5 years of harvest. Once the restoration and bulk of other thinning occurs, annual acres harvested drops considerably to as low as about 500 acres per year. And so you can see here the black bars indicate thinnings in reserve, where there are currently Douglas fir plantations that have been allocated to reserves in the research proposal. And this is one of the key projects that's being designed as part of the forest management planning stage, is what types of management activities would we use here to take these areas that are currently plantations and help transition them to the structure and species diversity of the reserve system. Thinnings of those plantations in reserve would happen during the first 20 years. And so that's why you see the black bars here, and then they drop out. The greater acreage of harvest in extensive during the first 20 years, which you can see here in the green and white, are in part due to thinnings to help transition current Douglas fir plantations to some of the more complex stand structures in extensive, as well as helping to promote trees that are wind firm and capable of surviving and thriving in those 125-year rotations in extensive. The graph on the right shows the projected annual harvest volume in million board feet per year. And so you'll see, of course, variations across the 5-year periods, but the projection, according to this analysis, is for an average of approximately 17 million board feet on average annually across all treatment types. And so you can see here that mixture of thinning in reserve in the first 20 years, the extensive treatments in the green and white, and then in the blue is the intensive, with the regeneration harvests in the solid blue, and the blue and white here is the intermediate thinning treatments. And so here we can look at annual revenue projections across all treatments based on the harvest estimates on the previous slide. The red line here at the top is projected gross revenue, while the bar graph shows net revenue projections. And the 50-year cash flow that we saw on the first slide, that black line would actually lie right on top of the bars here for the first 50 years. Remember, these are 5-year time periods here, these increments. And so that first 50 years lines up with that $5.4 to $6.1 million projection here for the net revenue. And this incorporates harvest expenses that went into Mason, Bruce, and Girard's modeling, including silvicultural costs, including things like site prep, planting, pre-commercial thinning, as well as administration and sales, road construction, maintenance, and logging and hauling costs. So next we'll move on to looking at estimated annual expenditures. And this, so that was a look at how the revenue projections were modeled by MBG and the analysis at the sub-watershed and landscape levels that drove that analysis. And as I said, now we'll look at the estimated annual budget for the Elliott State Research Forest, including projected costs, both for startup and annual expenditures. So first we'll start with the annual expenditures. This is OSU's estimate of the average annual expenses associated with operating the research and management program on the Elliott. We ran multiple long-term budget scenarios, and the models show financial sustainability of the forest for at least 50 years, which is the length of the model period. The budget model is designed to be net neutral. There is flexibility to add or reduce costs to accommodate uncertainties. And as I mentioned earlier, the continued refinement of these numbers is part of that forest management plan process and clarity on several key areas. And so if we take a closer look at some of the line items here in this table, you'll see that the personnel in this budget estimate are organized into 2 categories: operations and research. There are a list of operations personnel as part of this model that includes foresters, including a lead forester, administrative support, a GIS inventory specialist, a forest engineer, a business log accounting specialist, and a forest technician. And so that's encompassed here in the 7 FTE for those full-time people. The research side includes funding for an executive director, a communication specialist, data specialists, 3 professorial research faculty with specialties in the physical, biological, and social sciences, several research technicians, graduate research assistants, and student interns. And so that's all encompassed here in that 11 FTE. You'll see a line item here for operating equipment based on estimates from the OSU research forest, and a line item here for ODF wildfire protection assessment at $4 per acre. And this is ODF's base protection program, which is delivered through the local forest protection districts, and landowner assessment to support this wildfire protection program is based on acreage. So that's incorporated here. There's an operations working budget here, which addresses primarily road maintenance and infrastructure upkeep. You'll see a line item here for HCP monitoring, the Habitat Conservation Plan. And these are additional expenses associated with monitoring under the HCP for effectiveness monitoring. Compliance monitoring and annual reporting are covered under the other personnel costs and the monitoring program that's part of the research program on the Elliott. For office and facilities, the estimate in this budget model is $250,000 per year, and that's for rent and lease at the beginning of the Elliott while a new facility is built. And the assumption in this budget model is based on a new facility, as was outlined in the research proposal, but we can talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. Also in here is facilities upkeep and maintenance and office supplies. And as outlined in the research proposal, the infrastructure and research station, as it's currently envisioned, would include facilities that house research labs, bunkhouses for those engaged in research and educational activities, climate controlled storage, classrooms, and a visitor space. You'll also see here variable research monitoring costs, supplies, equipment, maintenance, and logistics. There's a line item for data storage, management, and quality control. And if you have been part of the forest management plan conversations, we've talked a little bit about our plans for the data management and storage, and this is planned to be publicly accessible interface similar to the H.J. Andrews. There's a line item for vehicle maintenance here based on an estimate of 15 vehicles to support the research and operations activities, and a 3% OSU overhead on expenses not including the contingency fund. And then finally here at the bottom is this contingency fund, which would allow for funds to be set aside yearly and build up over time to help address any uncertainties that might come up that we're unable to plan for in advance. And so the total estimated average annual expenses to run the research program and the management of the Elliott are estimated in this budget model as approximately $5.45 million. So here we can see the long-term projections for how the estimated annual revenue and the expenses line up. As outlined in the research proposal, other sources of funding are possible to complement operations revenue sources such as grants, contracts, in-kind contributions from agencies, partners, and collaborators. This financial analysis is based only on that harvest revenue under the experimental design and estimated expenses for the management, operations, and research. So we can see that the Elliott State Research Forest is projected to achieve long-term sustainability based on the estimated annual expenses and the projected revenue that we've just gone over. The harvest revenue doesn't exist until year 4. So you can see that here with the green line. As there are initial years where the research program is just getting off the ground, and years 1 through 3 are supported by separate startup funds. So next we'll take a closer look at the estimates for those startup funds. So currently startup costs are estimated at $35 million. And you can see this is signified by the yellow star in year 1. The startup funds are used in years 1 through 3 to support the early costs of the research forest before the Elliott is able to generate revenue to support research and operations. And the expenditure of the startup funds over 3 years is indicated by these blue stars here. And as I mentioned before, harvest income begins in year 4. Operations personnel and most research personnel are hired during the first year to help start the research forest. But full research personnel are hired once sustained revenue is generated. And you also see here that there's $820,000 built in over the first 5 years. This is for 60 months of support for someone or multiple people coming in to help with specialized tasks during the establishment of the research forest. So this could be assistance from faculty with specific expertise, people who have expertise in monitoring equipment installation, and that would be more on a contract basis. This is separate from the people who are hired by the forest long-term. So let's take a closer look at the estimated startup costs. In the December 2020 research proposal that was approved by the State Land Board, $35 million was estimated for startup costs, including $17 million for facilities and infrastructure, $10 million for working capital to bridge those early non-revenue years, and $7.3 million for inventory instrumentation of the forest that contributes to both data collection and monitoring as part of the research program. We'll take a closer look at what went into the estimates for infrastructure, working capital, and an example of one of the research monitoring programs here, the Carbon and Climate Monitoring Program. There are similar detailed estimates of the monitoring and monitoring programs that are also listed here. This line item for research plots and inventory are estimates based on aerial and ground-based LiDAR, aerial photography, and permanent or temporary plot installation. And so first to look at estimated infrastructure costs. These are based on estimates for new construction using square footage estimates for office, research, living, and educational space. Infrastructure costs are variable based on the size, scope, and quality of a new research facility. And DSL and OSU are currently exploring alternative infrastructure options, including the possibility of using an existing facility and renovating it to suit the Elliott's needs. These estimates were made by investigating comparable research stations and in consultation with Libby Ramirez, the OSU lead architect. In addition to investigating new construction versus renovation costs based on recurrent options, cost estimates can also be refined by drafting more detailed plans for the amount and type of space required to carry out the research program and the related educational programming. And so you can see here, as I said, this analysis and estimate is based on new construction. You can see the square footage costs here, and then scaled up to the full size of the research and education facility. This table shows estimated working capital startup costs for the first 3 years based on personnel and operations. And note that the personnel is lower in the startup phase as additional capacity is added once the forest has annual revenue coming in. So you'll see here, for the operations personnel, it's 6 people versus 7 full-time people. And for the research personnel, it's 9 versus 11. The research proposal identifies 4 high-priority research areas: carbon and climate monitoring, aquatic and riparian monitoring, wildlife and biodiversity, and social science and recreation monitoring, in addition to the inventory and monitoring needs. We are going to take a closer look at one of these categories, the carbon and climate monitoring, as an example. And just wanted to make a note as we look at this example that these are for expenses related to the research monitoring program, not any inventory or monitoring needs that would be related to incorporating carbon offsets on the voluntary market. So this example shows estimated research startup costs for carbon and climate monitoring based on input from researchers whose work is in relevant areas of expertise. And so you can see here several items laid out. There are climate stations listed here. that would be approximately $10,000 each. And this estimate includes a budget for 16 climate stations that would be installed across the research forest, with an additional $40,000 for equipment to do additional monitoring within the watershed as needed, including looking at slope transects. You'll see a line item here for soil pits, looking at collecting data on things like soil horizons, soil texture, fragment content, root distribution. There's a line item here for personnel, specifically to work on the soil pits and equipment installation. There's a line item here for additional lab equipment, looking at carbon nitrogen analyzing and drying ovens related to the materials that are part of the rest of this budget, and canopy and soil monitoring within the canopy, looking at things like temperature, relative humidity, and moisture and soil temperature as well. And that includes a budget for 6 climate towers. So this is just one example of the types of costs that went into building this budget model. This is an example from the H.J. Andrews of the types of information that would become available with this type of a monitoring program. And so here you can see an example to the real-time data that would be accessible from the Elliott. Again, this is from the H.J. Andrews system. We'll also be building long-term data records, including monitoring over decades that can show historic trends, current conditions, and also be used to model future conditions. And as part of the Elliott, we'll be making similar measurements on trees and reserves and across a range of active management scenarios. And this is just a small snapshot of the type of information that will be generated as part of the research program. So to close, I wanted to review the assumptions that have gone into this budget model as we've discussed the data that has gone in the analysis, and also the areas for continued refinement at this stage. Costs associated with the public entity are not considered in the model due to lack of certainty on the structure of that entity and the needs as of the time of this assessment. Startup costs related to infrastructure are subject to change based on the ultimate size and scope of the research facility, and whether a new construction or renovation of existing facilities is determined to be the better option. Cost estimates and revenue projections are subject to refinement based on the forest management plan process, and there will be further analysis and fine scale tuning of the research management program that will contribute to this step. And finally, the budget model is based on the assumption that forest operations begin in fiscal year 24. And so with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you, Paul, and open it up for questions and comments.
Thank you, Shannon, for the presentation. I appreciate it. The one thing I will add on the assumption about the costs related to the entity, this model was done around the idea of OSU ownership as well. So there is the executive director, some of those costs are captured in this. It doesn't capture all costs that would come with the entity, as we're not sure what that final legislation will look like at this point as well. So thank you. And before we move to questions, I think just as we kicked off, I saw Dean DeLuca join us. So Tom DeLuca, the Dean of the College of Forestry, is with us, and we're going to give him the hardest questions. So we're glad he's here. And with that, since we've had a few folks join once we got started, I just want to go through the instructions again real quick for questions. We want you to use your little yellow hand that you have there. If you go down to the bottom toolbar, you'll see a happy face with a plus sign on it that says reactions. If you open that, there's a raise hand function in there. So we ask you to raise that hand, and we will call on you, and Anna will unmute you when I call on you to ask your question. Again, we want to try and get to everyone here and have everyone have a chance to ask a question. So we ask that you have one question at a time, and we'll address that one. If you have a clarifier on that question, please finish with that. And then what we'll do is, I'm sure some of you have more than one question. We'll ask you to wait and respect others to ask questions, and then get back in line again and come back around, and we'll be happy to do that. And we'll go till 7 o'clock. And then also, again, just a reminder, we're here to talk about the presentation you saw tonight and the financials around the forest. So we look forward to your questions and providing you as much information as we can tonight. And so let's go ahead and get started. And Peggy, you were the first with your hand up. If you'd like to, and if you would unmute her.
Okay, she did. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I did listen to this presentation before, so this is the second time around. But I continue to have a concern, and you did mention it, that this budget was done before the possibility of a public entity. But we are coming really close to having that public entity legislation. And so at what point are you going to update your model to talk about the staff for the board, any contracting, any HR work, whatever, because it is different from the original proposal that you had. Thank you. And I have another question. I'll hold it for later.
Right, Peggy, thank you. I'll start this and then I think I'll turn it over to Shannon to add as well. And so, Peggy, as I mentioned, we have some of the costs that will transfer over to the authority within this current budget. We have, and of course, there was some of that overhead that OSU would have that will now be held by the authority is within the budget model that we have. There is some unknowns around the board composition as we get that out of the, we have the concept. And there is the, like you said, the HR piece as well, which should be fairly small, as most of these employees will be OSU as well, with just what we see as a handful. However, as we get the legislative concept and the language back out of legislative council and it gets out to the public, we'll be working at that point to update those numbers and work with DSL and to make sure that those are included in the plan. Okay. All right, Peggy, thank you very much. Sue Craig, you are next. Let's see, Anna, are you? Sue, if you're there. Okay, there you go.
Yes, thank you very much. I have watched this again also, and I am still concerned that this is totally based on the forests and how we use them for how many board feet, instead of the so many other ways that this forest can be used. And as Peggy says, we're coming pretty close to your legislative concept, yet I don't see any broadening of bringing in paying, for instance, with carbon sequestration, that kind of thing. It seems to me still to be very limited. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. And I think we'll start with Shannon and maybe Tom will add to that as well.
Sure, happy to. So as I mentioned, the financial analysis and the budget model, as Sue pointed out, it is based solely on timber revenue under the experimental design. So as we've mentioned, there are no plans, and this is not part of the experimental design or the research forest, to conduct timber harvest solely for the purpose of revenue. So any revenue that comes from timber harvest is under the experimental design, which is modeled under that revenue assumption by Mason, Bruce, and Girard, and would be in our projections no more than 1% of the forest annually. That doesn't mean that there aren't other values on the forest, and those values are things that we are incorporating into the management as well as the research program of the forest. Because this analysis is based only on timber revenue, it's actually a little bit more conservative, because there are opportunities for things like grant funds coming in through some of the research that's being done there, through partnerships, through collaborations, and possibly through carbon if it's deemed that that's appropriate, that would be layered on top. And carbon was actually part of the financial analysis during the research proposal process. And I might kick it over to Randy to see if he has any other details that he would want to share, because he was a key part of that.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. And Sue, it's a great point. And, it does look like it's obviously missing from our analysis. But again, the way that this all started was that we developed a research proposal and a research design. The revenue from harvesting was derivative from that research design, which then was the financial question. Is this feasible? Can it be sustained? And the answer to that is yes. At one point in time, we had carbon. DSL had contracted through us to do a carbon analysis based on a prior research proposal design. And in that, it was evaluating things like the difference between private protocol and public protocol in a California compliance market, showed highly variable potential revenue from the forest, prefaced on the amount of timber that was going to be removed in the baseline case. Since then, it's pretty much a public protocol. It lowers the value and amount of carbon. And we see that as an additional revenue source that would also fit within the research design. We just haven't pursued it in any great detail because at this point it's unnecessary for financial stability. But if we bring carbon revenues in to this, then it can offset some other costs or be reinvested in the forest for some value added research.
And if I could just follow up on that, carbon is a key part of the research proposal and the forest management plan, and is expected to be part of that research program. And so anything related to carbon, including the potential of carbon offsets, we would envision as being nested under that research program and a part of it, not separate.
All right, thank you. And thank you, Sue, for that question. All right, next we will go to Clark.
Okay, there we go. Well, first of all, thanks for hosting the session tonight. Really helpful. Just a bit of background. I'm a OSU College of Forestry alum, 1977, which sounds like ages ago, but forest management degree. And the best thing I ever did in my career actually was attend OSU. I was also a long time employee of the Oregon Department of Forestry, retired from the department in 2009 as the Associate State Forester, but I also spent 5 years as the district forester for the Coos District and was the manager of the Elliott for those 5 years between actually 1989 to 1994. And if those years sound challenging, with the owl listing in 1990 and Murrelet shortly after that and salmon after that, those were 5 really interesting years in a lot of different ways. So I have followed obviously the saga of the Elliott for a long, long time. My first question tonight actually is, I'm curious if you have within your budget and particularly on the expense side, a breakdown of total annual costs devoted to ESA compliance, whether it's survey and monitoring of endangered species or continued work and pursuit of a revised HCP for single or multi-species and all of those. So I'll start with that question.
Thanks, Clark. Great question. Katy, do you want to start that?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, Clark, we do have a lot of funding actually for monitoring, both because it's part of our research program, because typically in a research forest, you have a backbone program that covers monitoring of many things from, the amount of down wood to the number of snags. We also have some research undergoing in the Coast Range right now that is looking at marbled murrelet in terms of habitat developing acoustic detection methodology so that we can really detect the presence of the species, not just at the places they happen to be seen, but we're very interested in a broad swath of where they're located on the forest. So that's one of the major differences is we do have a major monitoring program. We also have a monitoring program in our budget that's focused primarily on the HCP. And Geoff, if we need him, can speak a little bit to the HCP as well, but that's about to go to the agencies and to go into NEPA, so it's well underway. And so we've considered monitoring to be a key component, both the backbone of our research plan, as well as to have monitoring using a multitude of technologies for endangered species.
Okay, all right, Clark, did we answer that question for you?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I guess, just reflecting back on the early years, we were, until we procured the first HCP with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we were in a mode of take avoidance surveying. And, even after the HCP was implemented, we were still required to do significant surveying for occupancy for operational purposes, obviously not for research. My recollection is that, within that first decade, maybe towards the 8th or 9th year, we were at somewhere between $250,000 to $325,000 per year just for operational surveying for take avoidance, and for both species, both owl and murrelet. So I just, that it's a significant cost, obviously. Again, totally aside from more traditional research monitoring. So I was just curious, how that factors into, the budget over the long term. And whether, the HCP that's now being pursued possibly, after all these many years has, much more, built into it to not require nearly as much operational take avoidance surveying.
All right, Geoff, did you want to add something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in the context of the HCP, I think that your last statement is true, and it's one of the benefits of a habitat conservation plan. There's a monitoring plan that's associated with it that's costed out in advance. That's part of the regulatory requirement of the permit. And we worked closely with OSU to integrate the cost that the agencies are saying will be necessary to monitor the HCP we've asked for into the operational costs for the forest, so that the overlap between research monitoring and compliance monitoring would be optimized, but both would be accounted for in the budget numbers you're seeing.
Okay. All right, Geoff, thank you for that. Clark, thank you for the question. We will move next to Janet.
Hi, thank you. I just say really quickly, to follow up with what Mr. Seeley was saying is, I was one of the citizen scientists that worked with Coast Range Forest Watch doing marble murrelet surveys, and we would, survey in active timber cells, and it was pretty much just everywhere that there was native forest and older trees. You were pretty guaranteed to find murrelet. So it seems like it's pretty easy to avoid them. Just avoid cutting down the most valuable habitat. But what I wanted to say was just to follow up on the discussion about carbon credits. I know that's not part of the budget, but I know people will continue to pursue carbon market because the Coast Range is able to sequester more carbon than any other ecosystem on Earth. We know that now. But what I'd like to say is that carbon markets are immoral. They exacerbate inequalities. They allow pollution to continue somewhere else, and it just often exacerbates inequalities. And I also just would wonder what the efficacy of that would be on the Elliott, especially in areas that these current plans are already protecting those trees. So how could you get paid for protecting carbon that you're already, saying you're going to protect, and, the public has fought really hard to get this forest protected. So, if certain areas aren't threatened with logging, I think it would be wrong to, get paid to, store that carbon. But that's just my 2 cents. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Janet. It's a great point. And I'm going to turn it over to Tom for this one.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Janet. That is a really good point. And it's it's exactly related to why we have been really careful about how we approach carbon as a portion of any revenue projections for the forest, where we had originally done that detailed analysis, and then between uncertainties about the ability of the forest to enter under private versus public protocol, and then ultimately, being quite clear it would enter under public, but then also questioning the ethics underpinning carbon offsetting is partly why we have set that aside and are focused on the self-sufficiency of the forest, economic self-sufficiency of the forest based on the research-driven timber revenue. So all the timber harvest that happens on the forest is directly and inextricably linked from the research activities and agenda. And that is the primary source of revenue that we're basing our projections on in terms of cost versus revenue. So I appreciate your point, and we could go on or talk further about it, but I think that you kind of hit it right on the head. So one of the key reasons we took a step back from carbon.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for that question, Janet. All right, it looks like we are back to Peggy.
Here I am again. Oh, Kevin, you weren't fast enough. So I just want to make a couple of points. But one is, by the way, it's my understanding that the LC for the public entity, public authority, should be out by the 14th of January. That's not a very long time. So I'm assuming that behind the scenes, you are going to be doing some of those calculations, even though you don't have them in this calculation today. My question this time is the link between the Mason MBG analysis and the forest management plan. It's my understanding that the forest management plan will be the governing document that will determine how much logging you'll be doing. So that, I think that's the main thing. And along with that, how are you going to get where are you getting the $35 million startup costs and the common school fund dollar appraisal? Is that still the same as it was?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just let me finish really quickly. That
sorry.
I just want to say that it's my understanding. It's my fault. It's my understanding that the state land board and the legislature doesn't want to be the funder of this forest once we agree on this public authority and OSU management.
Okay, I'll start with there's a couple questions in there, Peggy, and I'll try to hit them all as I remember them. So the question regarding the 35 million startup costs, that is the piece that DSL is working on to see how we can do that. I don't know, perhaps Geoff will come on in a minute and talk about that, about potential sources for that, but I think they're looking at several different ways to get that there as well. The appraisal on the common school fund, that's also something that that DSL is working on, and that I know there's some updating going on that. And again, I'm going to kick that one to Geoff there, but I'll let him think about those, and I will go for the first part of your question to Shannon regarding the FMP.
Sure. So Peggy, to your question about Mason, Bruce, and Girard's analysis and how that fits with the forest management plan, That analysis is based on the experimental design and the information that we had as part of the research proposal. And so those two pieces are really closely linked. That analysis, the most recent version was in 2020. And so now with the forest management plan, we are also working off that research proposal. So everything is really tightly connected. We are taking the research proposal and looking at how to implement that on the landscape. And part of that is doing some of that fine scale tuning to the treatment allocations if needed, and then updating that analysis. So we're not going to be taking the analysis that you saw today off the shelf and applying it to the forest management plan. We're going to be continuing to refine it along with the new data that we're getting and the decision-making criteria that we will be adding to it during the management plan process. So I hope that answers your question.
Geoff, did I get you off mute? There you go. Okay.
You did. You did. The appraisal that the current appraisal we have was dated 2016. We have a contract now for that appraisal to be updated. We will have a new value sometime in the spring. There are some things that are pushing that valuation down, and there are some things that have happened since 2016 that are pushing that valuation up. So I can't tell you today that we have an expected change or target valuation in mind, or have been given any sense of that from the company doing the appraisal. The governor has made it clear that the decoupling of the Elliott is one of her top priorities for the upcoming February session. So that's priority number one in terms of funding, is to at least secure in this session the money that is necessary to finish the decoupling at the currently appraised value. We do have other sources of funding for decoupling and or startup costs that we're pursuing and in active conversations around from various federal streams of funding that are available and perfectly suited for a research forest with the design platform that's contemplated for the Elliott. So that's ongoing, and depending on what happens with the appraised value and where we land on startup costs at the end of the day with the outcome of the legislative session, we'll begin to take a look at the different threads of funding that we've been investigating and begin to match and marry them in the best way that knits together the full package. So that is the best answer I can give you today. And so it's state money, federal funding through land water conservation funds in principle, and another potential new federal program from the USDA, and potentially the carbon revenue. Those are all the ones that are being looked at as of now.
Peggy, did you have a follow on to that, or?
No, I'm now on to the next question. I want to know what happened to the Shutter Creek tour.
Okay, well, let's get, we'll let Kevin go, and then we'll talk about Shutter Creek next, okay? All right. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. A question about sort of your year one budget. It looked like you were around $24 million or something, and that seemed like a very aggressive first year, kind of given the time that it takes to ramp up and do engineering and permitting and contracting, and just staffing up that quickly. I used to be in project management, so it just seemed unusually very fast first year budget, and then it dropped down considerably in year 2 and 3. And this scale of project, sometimes it takes several years to build up all that infrastructure and spending ability, even just from a internal management standpoint. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Okay, Shannon, do you want to take that, or would you like me to?
Either way, would you prefer to start or would you like me to?
Go ahead, Shannon, you start.
Okay, and then I'll turn it back over to you. So really appreciate the point. For the model that we have right now, we did have that first year as being higher, as you said, close to 24 million. And then the remainder of the startup funds spent out over years 2 and 3. I think a piece of that is that we're not necessarily starting flat-footed in year 1. A lot of the work that's going into the forest management plan development and working with researchers and some of the data collection and the monitoring equipment installation that's happening during that process is also serving to start up the forest. But we also do completely recognize that there will be a ramp up. And so the plan is for those funds to be spent out over the first few years, and whether we adjust those numbers between years 1 and 2 is something that I think we're looking at now at this stage. But definitely appreciate that point. And Paul, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No, I think you hit it quite well. We understand it'll be a spread of that, but we're trying to be conservative in this estimate and make sure that we have a model that's sustainable. So we modeled that in the first year, understanding that they would be expended over a couple of years. Geoff, I think, has something to add.
Yeah, I would say the other piece of the equation is that that there's not an expectation that the new entity, the authority, will go into effect and this transition will happen immediately upon the passage of legislation. That there are some predicates to the transfer from being an asset of the Common School Fund to being the Elliott State Research Forest. And I wouldn't expect that to happen even in 2022. And so after we know it's going to happen, there will be more on-ramp available for the preparations for the first day.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that point, Geoff, this was a small line item on the last slide, but this budget is projected for year 1 to be fiscal year 24. So we do have a little bit of time to get all of these pieces together.
Yeah, great. All right, Kevin, thanks for that question. Before we go to Bob, we'll go next to Bob. Shutter Creek. So we had a good tour out there. It's a very interesting facility, which presents potentially some opportunities for us to use as well. One, it's a very large facility. It would far exceed the needs of the Forest Authority and OSU. With that, I don't believe that maintaining that entire site within the budget of the Forest Authority is sustainable. So discussions with DSL and others about partnerships with others that might be on that hill with us and help us to do that piece there. Some of the facilities, certainly, I think there's some that can be modified. There will still be a cost with that, not a small cost, but perhaps not 17 million to get those into shape for the research that we would need there as well. So it is an interesting proposition, and it's a discussion that we just started last Thursday out there, visiting the site and ongoing to see who else across the state may partner with us to make that a viable site for the Forest Authority. So thanks, Peggy. And we'll go to Bob.
And start video. Hello there. My questions, I'm mostly concerned about the Common School Fund and local jobs and fire history. But my question has to do with that 50-year average of 17 million feet a year and the projected income for a 50-year period. One, the Elliott grows 60 to 80 million board feet a year. So you're growing, if you're only doing 17 million feet a year, 50 or 60 million feet of fuel every year. The entire Elliott burnt down. So I'm concerned about the research design, not the objectives, but those tiny little polygons, 4 and 5 and 10 polygons for a sub-basin that is likely to burn up completely or blow down. The entire Elliott burned up 100,000 acres 3 or 4 times in the 1800s. In 1962, when the trees were a lot smaller because they were just the reprod from the fires, 100 million feet blew down. in just a few hours on the Columbus Day storm. Well, 17 million feet a year doesn't accommodate that. And I think further, there's no plan to harvest snags. So we have the 1996 landslides, the 62 Columbus Day storms, the 1800 fires. Those things are fairly common occurrences on the Elliott. There's a large history of them. And this 50-year plan just seems oblivious to biological reality. All that fuel is growing, all that fuel is created, and there doesn't seem to be any concern or consideration for that in the research design.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate the question. And I'm going to let Tom start that and let the rest of the team weigh in as well.
Great. Thank you, Bob. That's a great question. And Katy, please feel free to jump in. Let me just get this started. You're absolutely right, Bob. And all biomass has the potential to burn, and the coastal range is no different. We recognize that. We recognize the amount of productivity on the Elliott, and that all that productivity can function as fuel and will. I mean, fires have been burning in these forests since they were established post-glacial recession. And we look at it as an opportunity, actually. Having those small research polygons are exactly why, exposed to fire, if it were to happen, is information that we need to know. We need to know what treatments on the landscape are going to be more resilient to fires, as we're going to be experiencing them more and more as time goes forward, given the projections for climate change. And the last few years have really borne that out. Our traditional management practices are susceptible to fire, and we need to be looking at alternative practices that are more resilient. And this would provide us with that opportunity to investigate that. So while we absolutely do not want the forest to burn down, we do look at having the experimental plots in place as an opportunity should that happen. It wouldn't be a crisis should it happen. It would be an opportunity. In terms of the reserves that are on the forest and the role that they play, they are also one of the treatments that are on the landscape that we'll be monitoring. And that would be a no action alternative type look at a treatment. And we don't look at that as a catastrophe if it were to burn, because that would be the natural process under a no action alternative. It would be something that we would follow up with, in terms of evaluating the whole ecosystem impact of that fire, looking at fire severity in different treatment units, and impacts to soil, impacts to runoff and erosion, hydrophobicity, microbial and biotic impacts. And that's the role of a research forest. So I recognize your expertise in the area, Bob, and appreciate it, especially the fire history piece. And I appreciate the question, but I do think that the research forest really does provide an opportunity on that front. And Katy, anything you want to add to that?
I also want to add that the landslide potential, we are very interested in that, and as well as the dynamics of that, and its the cumulative effects on fish and fish habitat, both good and bad, as well as the effects on the treatments and how they kick off or suppress the potential of these stream debris flows to occur. So that's also something we're very interested in, and hope to have a major study underway on that, as well as the issue of windthrow. I couldn't agree with you more. I spent a long time as the extension forester up on the North Coast, And windthrow is a huge piece of this, and it isn't accounted for very well in any of our growth and yield models, to be honest. Whichever one you use doesn't include it in there. It's as if everything is going to stand till the day it's harvested, and we know better than that. And not to mention insects and disease and other things. So we see this because the timber production is not the goal of the forest. The research is the goal of the forest. Then to have those natural disturbances and maybe somewhat new disturbances through our changing climate, we'll have a place that hopefully we can understand those and start to incorporate a more realistic way that growth and yield is calculated in forests, and how it's going to change as the climate changes, because that's also, I think, of great value. I'm really happy to work with you on some of the fire history, and also what were the conditions at the time those fires were burning that led to that. 4 fires in 1 century is a lot for that region. So I think that's also really interesting finding. And we have some folks lined up now that we're going to hope to do some fire scar work. And so we're happy to learn from you as well as we go forward in doing that. So
can I rephrase that question just slightly?
Yeah.
One thing, 4 fires in those areas is really common within a century. The 6-year jinx of the Tillamook fire is the most famous. They typically burn 3 or 4 times a century. But the question on the economic basis had to do with salvage. 17 million feet a year, and 1 or 2 or 3 or 500 million feet can blow over or burn up within hours. How many local jobs are being affected by having this be a research forest? And what is the income being projected as far as snag salvage from these predictable events?
Katy, do you want to take that?
I could speak from the research proposal. The discussion of salvage came up in that realm, and areas that are in reserves, we do not plan on doing salvage. We want to see the natural processes going on. Under the intensive, we would use a salvage model in there because we're trying to maximize wood production on those intensively managed lands. And in the extensive, it's something that we're still discussing and trying to figure out where that would fall within the natural processes that we're trying to emulate. So the answer that salvage is mixed, and the value to the local communities is, again, it's a value that's based on multiple communities within that community, and many people have values for different reasons, and that's what we're hoping to integrate on this forest by producing a combination of whether it's wood, conservation, recreation experiences, scenic, and whatever the value is that's held in that community, we hope to contribute to an integration of those values.
The question was jobs, not personal values.
Well, those are values and jobs. Yes, they do create jobs as well. And 17 million board feet is going to create jobs. Not as many as 50, but not as few as 0. So, yeah.
Thanks, Bob. And it's about balance. We're trying to get that balance here as well. We'll go to Janet with her question next, please.
Hey, I really appreciate this conversation. I just have a question I've been wanting to ask for a while about the standalone public entity. I'm still not sure how I feel about it, and I'm worried that it's going to incur extra costs, which could put pressure to Logmore to fund this additional entity. And I've just never really gotten a satisfactory explanation as to why we need this standalone entity. I heard OSU said they were worried about liabilities, why they didn't want to own it, and I didn't really understand what liability they're trying to avoid, except that I remember Tom mentioning like the costs of roads, and yeah, so if someone could just elaborate a little more on why this is really good for the Elliott. I do understand it might be good to have a standalone entity so Elliott issues aren't like lost in a larger entity like the DSL. But yeah, I'm just worried about additional costs with it. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Janet. And I'll start that one and I'll ask any of the team to add in as well. So part of it is the liability for OSU. So, you know, this is a budget model and forecast. It's based on many assumptions. We think it's good. We think it's sound, and we believe the forest is sustainable. But there are actions that could happen, catastrophic events that would drive that revenue down and perhaps require the forest to need additional funding beyond that of what's sustained on the forest as well. In those cases, that's where Oregon State does not have a means to cover those types of costs. You know, our only backing that we would not use for this is the tuition that our students pay as well. That's our main source of income. And again, we're not, while we want to go into this endeavor and we're into it, we're not willing to risk the tuition dollars or tuition increase for the students and our students of Oregon as well. You know, other factors too is that as we went through this, the process and worked the legislation piece and the governance structure as well, you know, a lot of the comments we had was about having checks and balances in place around OSU's operation of the forest as well. That landed to this entity of an authority that has a board of directors appointed by the state land board that has a say over the management of the forest. You know, one of the things we heard just at the last meeting was that, you know, OSU is going to make this, they're going to use this forest to make money and fill their coffers. However, that's not true in this model. We don't have the revenue goes into the authority, and the authority then parses it out for the operation of the forest and controls it. So this puts good control mechanisms in that with our advisory committee, they felt very comfortable with this structure to control the forest and make sure that it's driven by the people of Oregon and not necessarily just Oregon State by itself as well. And, you know, and as far as the cost, I would say we foresee this agency or this authority being very light. A board of directors, perhaps with the executive director, which would have been in the model as well with Oregon State to have an executive director, perhaps a small staff, but you know, greatly supported by other agencies for their HR work, their equipment support, maintenance needs as well. And that could be Oregon State to provide that support. It could be other agencies in the state as well. Anything, anyone else on the OSU team, anything to add?
I would just follow up on Janet. I think you kind of hit it actually, is that another value of the entity is that it's an entity devoted to the research mission of the forest. And that's key. It's not a agency that has a raft of other responsibilities, and research isn't necessarily their number one objective. Whereas this entity exists for the research forest to exist and meet all the, you know, not just the research objectives, but also all the other, you know, specific objectives of the forest, such as, you know, full public access and recreational access and the set of commitments that were listed out in the research plan. But the real point being that this entity solely exists for the research forest, and thus the mission of research won't get lost. So often, long-term research doesn't continue on and become long-term research because agencies lose interest in funding of it when other financial burdens are experienced, and they end up having to cut budgets. And I've seen this so many times with federal and state entities having to cut out research, long-term research projects because of financial constraints and other priorities. And in this case, the number one priority is the research forest, and that's so the entity has this value in really focusing on that objective. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. And I just say too that, for OSU, this does reduce our financial risk, but the, Oregon State is all in on the Elliott. And this is still, we're accepting a lot of risk to move into this and to devote our research and our team to it. And we're excited for it as well. So it's not that Oregon State is backing off of the Elliott. It's just a different approach that allows us to move forward in a better direction as well. With that, I will turn it over to Clark for his next question.
Okay, thank you, Paul. This is a fairly specific question, but I think one that's important. I think we all recognize that in a number of respects, there may not be any place in Oregon where road maintenance and the ongoing reconfiguration and maintenance of roads in the woods are as important as they are on the South Coast, from a lot of different perspectives or a lot of different reasons. Certainly climate, weather, geomorphology, all of that play into that equation. And therefore, road maintenance tends to be very expensive on a per unit basis. So my question is, do you anticipate doing road maintenance through the plan in-house, or will it be contracted? And if contracted, do you feel like, at least preliminarily, you've got a pretty good handle on total road maintenance costs through time?
Shannon, you want to take that?
Sure, I can take that. And then if anyone else has any details to add, please feel free. So I just pulled up the annual expenses slide again to make sure that that I am addressing the right line item here. But in our operations working budget for the fully functioning research forest, once it's set up, we have a major category there, and road maintenance is, I think, the biggest chunk of that. And it's a little over $390,000 annually. And that's based on information that we have from foresters in the area who have worked with the Elliott. It's something that part of the forest management plan and the continued refined analysis, we will continue to look at and address and see if we need to adjust that at all. Part of the forest management plan process is that we are planning to contract with a firm or a group of individuals who have forest management experience, specifically in the Coast Range, to help us continue to ground truth and check those types of things to make sure that as we're continuing to work on the experimental design, the management plan, and updating these costs, that we're incorporating the most current information. That's also something that we're looking at now in this next layer of our experimental design, as we're looking at the treatment allocations and what would be needed to do the forest operations necessary. What are the road conditions? What are the slopes, the topography? Do we need to adjust any of those things? And so that's all part of this next part of the process.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything?
No, so I appreciate Janet's comment in the chat there, if you've seen it, about Mr. Gould there getting out and filling those potholes for us. So I think that's not an expense we have to worry about. Correct, David? Well, good.
One more thing is in all of our harvest projections, we've to go from the gross to the net, we've included the road costs associated with that as well. So.
Yeah. I would also say, to the point of whether work is done in-house or by contract as well, there'll be a mix of that, but one of the goals is to support the local economy and the local contract base there in that area. So
yeah,
we'll be looking for those opportunities.
Yeah, I think just as a learning lesson, when the Elliott first was being managed in the 1950s, the department attempted for a decade or so to do road maintenance in-house. And it became pretty clear to us that not only could we be more efficient over the long term in terms of the financial perspective? But frankly, the expertise is out, beyond, in our case, beyond the agency to really do a much better job. So, for most of the life of the Elliott under ODF responsibility, we contracted it out, working very closely with contractors, but saw that as a real positive.
Great. All right. Thanks, Clark. Well, I don't see any other hands, and we are down to 4 minutes left. So I'm going to give Tom the last word here as well, but I'd like to thank everyone for their participation tonight and the questions. Your questions help us to refine and improve on these products as well, and we appreciate this engagement. As you know, Peggy reminds us quite often, we are on a very fast road towards the legislation. So we want to make sure that we're sharing information as we get it, and incorporating public comments into everything we do as well. So with that, again, thank you for being with us tonight. And Tom, over to you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Paul. I don't have much to add to that, except to also just say thank you all for taking a chunk of your Tuesday evening to join us. And as Paul said, your questions really help push us and make us think about things that we haven't thought about or haven't dug into in enough detail. And it's very helpful in the process. And I want to encourage you that you're not limited to this open public session to send us your questions or comments or thoughts. You are always welcome to reach out by email or mail to send comments or thoughts as well as we work towards this ultimate goal. And the last thing I would just add is I hope you all have a really wonderful holiday season, and maybe we'll even get some snow here to brighten things up. So happy holidays, everybody, and thanks again.
All right, great. Thanks all. Have a great night, and we'll see you in the new year.